Welcome to Command and Control, a podcast series about military command and the control measures used to orchestrate combat engagements and wars. In the last season, we talked a lot about command. We dabbled in control, but took a largely tactical, land-centric view of C2. In this season, I wanted to focus a little more on the higher levels of C2 operational art, the pole-mill interface from both sides, and of course, to tip our lances at some of the windmills of contemporary doctrine. I'm Peter Roberts, your host. Join me as I try to understand more on this topic. Now, my concern about our failure to understand the control facet of C2 hasn't gone away, so you're going to have to indulge me if I try to get a guest to illuminate the dark space that is the intellectual void around this element of command and control. I'm delighted to say that the show is once again sponsored by Systematic.
Systematic are the creators of Citaware, the world's #1 C4 ISR software. We've designed C2 systems for the military since 1986 and supply more than 45 countries worldwide. With a heritage built on innovative development and rigorous testing, this is a proven in-service solution based on real customer requirement and tailored to fit your needs.
Most topics in command and control across organizations in the US and increasingly in NATO and nation states are revolving around JADC2. No matter where you are in the Western military world, the acronym is something you probably haven't missed. This is the US concept of Joint All-Domain Command and Control. Might have been around for a while, and by this stage, you think it would all be well-defined, if not well-funded. In reality, the reverse is true. The original program definition was a system that was aimed at providing the Joint Force Commander with unprecedented real-time information to shape their decision-making. It's important to understand that baseline for the original project. The Joint Force Commander was the singularity that was to get all the benefit. Anything else, necessarily below that, was an unfunded bonus. In delivering against this vision, it was critical for the four arms of the US Armed Services to provide their own respective information, intelligence, and data to the Joint Force team. Yet, as anyone who's operated with the US military knows, each service has problems talking internally or cohering their own information in one place, let alone across the divide between each arm. As a result, the money and drive for each service diverged from the original intent right from the start. And now there are 5 arms to align. As of March last year, the US Department of Defense was still walking this path and had a high-level strategy to support it, the simple version being, quote, information sharing to enable a Joint Force Commander, unquote. By June 2023, however, the bumper sticker had changed to make sense and act. Even in that, it had diverged considerably from the original ambition. No longer was it about the Joint Force Commander. Now it was about connecting every sensor and shooter to make the kill chain shorter and therefore improve lethality at the cutting edge, not give the commander an all-seeing eye. Given the money that has already been spent on this, that reversal is quite something. It's hard to determine what JADC2 as a program has spent or will cost. Comprised of several programs across the services, it is spending between $1 and $2 billion a year at the moment and is only in the experimentation phase. For 2024, the budgets vary. $66 million for the US Army's convergence work, $192 million for the US Navy's Project Overmatch, $500 million for the US Air Force's ABMS, $28 million for the Joint Staff cross-functional work, and $615 million for the data layer. Those are the official figures, but there's also then like $380 plus million in the AI and ML budget tagged to directly benefit JADC2. And none of this includes, of course, the sensors, the weapons, and the people, or the platform time in making this all happen. If the project budget and costs are unknown, so too is the sort of start date. Did it emerge from Project Jedi? Was it an outgrowth of one of the central single service projects? Did it start in 2022 or before? It's all a little bit confusing, given that back in 2020, the Army and Air Force started using the term CJADC2 to include the need to make this a solution for allies and partners by including it as a combined architecture. So it's a bit of a confused picture, and no definitive history of the project seems to exist, nor a decent estimate on the price. And some are thinking about it as the silver bullet for future wars, perhaps even, as China has done, triggering the PLA to start its own program of similar ambition and scope. I was thinking about who I could get to help me think through some of this and provide us with some ground truth. And I approached Frank Hoffman, the doyen of military knowledge and challenge. Frank lined me up with our guest today. Ralph Lopez, with a recommendation that maybe sit up and listen. So a hat tip to Frank as ever. I should set some context about Ralph. He is a former colonel in the US Army with a PhD in foreign affairs. Ralph is currently a deputy director at Carnegie Mellon Institute for Strategy and Technology. He's not simply a big brain, though. Ralph served operational tours in Iran and Afghanistan and in other corners of the world. So he can talk about command and control from both ends of the spectrum. Ralph, listen, welcome to the show. I gave a long, rambling, probably incoherent introduction to JADC2, CJADC2, or whatever it's going to be called in the end. And I want to start asking, well, do you agree with what I said at the start? Did I make any big errors that we need to correct?
So thank you very much for having me on the show. It's a pleasure. And you're right. Frank is one of the biggest brains and greatest intellects and mentors that a person could ask for. And really glad that he recommended me. And I'm happy to be here. As you said, I'm currently at the Carnegie Mellon Institute for Strategy and Technology as one of the deputy directors. And this topic is really at the forefront of a lot of discussions because some of the key technologies that enable JADC2 or CJADC2 are being invented right there. And so now regarding the intro, there's a couple of things that maybe I'll add. I won't go as far as to say that, hey, you were just wrong, but but I'll just add some color. So first, I was lucky enough to be part of the initial planning and experimentation team. In fact, I was the Army's lead planner for JADC2 when we first started. And, this thing started in May of 19 with just a casual conversation happening amongst senior leaders where, the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, Paul Selva, said, what we really need is a command and control system that includes all the domains and is joint, a joint all domain command and control solution. And that was it. And then this whole thing launched. And each of the services was asked to volunteer a team in order to participate to kind of flesh out what this idea could mean. What are the parameters around which we could build and develop this next generation capability? And that included a series of experiments to kind of test the limits of what some of these failure points could be with better data. So how long would it actually take to connect these systems? What are the failure points that we can actually see right now? And so from the very beginning, with Paul Selva's observation and with our initial experimentation, it was always about increasing capability at the edge. One of the first things that was outlined at the very beginning is that previous attempts to modernize command and control were perceived to have too much of an emphasis on giving omnipotent capability to senior leaders to enable 10,000-mile screwdrivers. It was never about that. It was the opposite. It was always from the very beginning about enabling capability at the edge. And not only enabling it at the edge, but enabling it in a way that was resilient and redundant. And those were some of those key attributes that were developed early on for the series of capabilities. One of the other key aspects that were initially identified is that the solution set was going to have multiple layers. It wasn't ever going to be just a transport problem or a data problem. It was multiple things combined. You need to address data management, a massive problem across the different services and across the different vendors and across the different partner states. You're going to have to address transport layers in order to make sure that you could eliminate the fragility associated with some of our current systems and their relative exposure to adversarial attack. Cloud storage, software engineering, analysis engines and AI, all operating at low latency, with redundant pathways, with zero trust. So none of these things really existed. They were all in their infancy, but all had to be matured, developed, prioritized in order to allow a collective effort at DoD to move forward. I mean, really so ambitious that I would say probably the largest innovation effort since the development of airline battle. So in 50 years, maybe the most comprehensive, most elaborate effort going forward. And if you were to try to pick out like a metaphorical story in order to, help appreciate the complexity, think of it like reinventing a highway system. We have what we have, but let's just say that we've quickly developed the ability to incorporate frictionless surfaces, high-speed turns, to be able to suspend some of the laws of physics in order to elevate and roads and access areas that we've never been able to access before. And because of the level of innovation that we want, there's no controls on who can participate, who can add features, who can add enclaves. And the resulting investment is developing new communities, is developing new commercial interests and new technologies. So all this is happening simultaneously. And you also have this cultural problem where the people using it have to learn new skills, have to learn to change their risk tolerances associated with what's possible because of the higher speeds. And so in reality, we're not talking about a highway. We're talking about really a full-scale reinvention of military decision-making and command and control. And it's going to be evolutionary. It was never going to be one thing is going to change it all. If we have better data, we're going to fix everything. It wasn't going to be like that. And so this whole process has been progressing in a way that's been slow. But to me, that is actually more of a strength than a loss. And the reason I say that is we don't know enough to make giant leaps forward. So moving bit by bit up front enables us to move much faster later. Kind of like the analogy when you're learning something new that's physical, you want to be slow and smooth because you go slow because it's smooth. And if you're smooth, you become faster later. That's, you can scale that up to this problem with complex adaptive organizations, right? If you try to move really fast up front, you end up running into a lot of friction points. You end up having more trouble in building stakeholder support than you would otherwise. And so these first few years, by going slow, we've been able to align service interests, align congressional support, do a better job of becoming more transparent in what we're trying to achieve, understanding the technologies that are available, doing a better job of including partners, being able to be more selective in what technologies that are currently in the pipeline are going to still be useful as opposed to being able to get rid of them. I mentioned in our earlier conversation this Army initiative to halt, fix, and pivot these capabilities, stop capability development efforts that are no longer viable, that are no longer useful, fix the ones that can be, that are in the process, and then pivot to next generation capabilities where appropriate. Another good example of how we're incrementally making strides forward that show progress is the number of contracts that are being offered on a regular basis. During the early stages, there weren't that many. As you've moved forward over the years, the contracts are in larger numbers with larger, small companies and industrial partners being involved and at greater values, right? So we're getting smarter, we're making better investments. An example is the recent Replicator initiative that was announced here in the last few months to increase the number of attritable unmanned autonomous systems in multiple domains, a critical component of the JADC2 ecosystem, because you have to be able to talk to it, you have to be able to maneuver it, you have to be able to recall it, you have to be able to resupply it, you have to be able to use it across domains and across formations and across regions. They have to have ranges that vary, all at reasonable costs. And so there's no new system going forward that isn't going to be integrated, that has to be integrated. And so the complexity continues, but we're making progress. And it's not unreasonable for folks to be skeptical, especially partners, given some of our history. It's not unreasonable for folks to think, hey, this is another failed thing like effects-based operations or the Army's future combat systems. But again, the way this monologue started was, those systems really failed from the beginning in their lack of imagination, in thinking that it was just about giving greater visibility at the top as opposed to increasing capacity at the bottom layer. I'll stop there and let us get into some questions.
Listen, there's a huge amount to unpack there. And I guess the starter for this is, when you started that, you said the original conversation came out of 2019. What was the driver for it? It's not like everything up till 2018 would be done badly, right? C2 weren't the problems in Afghanistan or Iraq. C2 wasn't the problems in Libya, weren't the problems that that we'd experienced in any of our military operations. What was the threat that catalyzed some of the thinking from the then vice chief?
Well, I think a good chunk of the discussion came out of the Russia Next Generation Warfare study that identified some of the C2 capabilities that were in the offing that had been displayed in the 2015-2016 time period in Ukraine. by the Russians, although in limited quantities, and what that meant for us as we were conducting modeling and simulations to counter those kind of capabilities. And the results weren't all that great. And then combined with some of the modeling and sims that were being done in the South China Sea, kind of a sober analysis of the anti-aircraft area denial capabilities that are being fielded there and the number of systems being designed to attrit our platforms, that combination kind of gave a sober assessment that needed to rethink how we're going to manage that, since our strength has always been our ability to command and control, maneuver, in order to adjust and retain our maneuver capability, our agility in combat. That's been one of our strengths. And so these adversarial capabilities in two different instances were clearly focusing on attacking that strength, on reducing the leverage that we gained from our command and control capabilities. And so that sober assessment is, it's easy to attack the penchant for services, to focus on service problems, not on joint or military problems writ large. And so, all these things were combined in this conversation to enable that kind of insight where, hey, what we really need is this kind of joint all domain capability, and there it went from there. The light bulb goes off. All these folks that are at the top of each of their respective organizations go back and say, we had this brilliant conversation. What do we have that we can do something about? And then, for the first year, everybody wants to rename everything. So during COVID, there was this great set of articles about the JADC2 tablet, at the very beginning.
I remember.
Yeah, right. So they were just using tablets to input data that was now structured data that allows for some simple analysis to give us predictive information about where supplies are going to be needed. It was great. It was a great initiative. But I don't know that it had anything to do with JADC2, but it was the JADC2 tablet. I'm sure you could probably find the JADC2 paperclip as well. And that happens during every series of these innovative kind of episodes where people just borrow the name and append it to whatever they want in order to get their thing funded.
It's got a massive ambition. Genuinely, when you start talking like that, you start to understand the level of ambition that this is. And for the single service chiefs to agree that, I think is something else, and a testament to both the requirement, but also the leadership in DoD at the time. And the pace behind it is quite impressive as well. You said it's slow. If I think about what it takes to build a ship or buy a tank, this is going at a hell of a pace. We're 4 years down the line. We're in experimentation phase. We're spending a lot of money, and we're seeing some improvements. But I guess one of those things that gets me is always the how. How are you going to make this work, right? Because whilst the chiefs at the time were all on board with it, you've now got a different set of tensions. You've got a different set of personalities. You've got a series of cultures and historic inter-service rivalries that often go against making this work in a joint combined way, right? So is how the big question?
Well, I wouldn't say it as how are we going to do it. I think the bigger question is when can we do it? And the reason I say when, I think there's a violent agreement, as you mentioned, among senior leaders about what we want to do. Nobody's going out in the public space and saying, I really am against this idea of having great command and control that's resilient and secure that allows me to take care of soldiers on the battlefield. I'm really against that. It's a terrible idea. That's not happening, right? This agreement at the senior level that we need this capability. What the tension is what do I do with the capabilities that I'm already building? I have all this money that I've invested. Do they meet the requirement? And are my requirements going to be subordinated to the other services? And so it's really kind of a classic principal agent problem. At the top level, OSD wants the most capability they can buy for a buck, and the services want as many bucks as they can get for their capabilities. And as they go forward, when they can afford to introduce these new capabilities, when they can afford to divest themselves of legacy equipment, which costs an enormous amount to maintain, when they can do these things, I think is a big part of this analysis. Not how. The technologies are already available to give us enormous improvement. And going back to Replicator, the reason it's attritable as opposed to expendable is because they want it to be something that requires low maintenance, that after a few years, you can just move it aside and replace it with the next generation of capabilities. Unlike the exquisite platforms that are so costly and necessary and useful, but so costly that you're really going to stay with them for a long time. And so That's this big conundrum that they're in, is they have all this legacy stuff. They have all these maintenance costs. They have the time involved to train people and personnel on these skill sets, the need to introduce these new routines, that whole organizational cost associated with implementing a new innovation at this scale. It takes time. So when can they put everything in place to get it to be effective, to come together? And is that going to be faster than our adversaries in trying to change the international order in some way, or affecting the international order in some way? So it's all relative, right? So the when isn't just when can I afford it? What's the price point? It's what's the risk involved in me waiting because I can afford it, as opposed to not waiting. So there's this constant exchange between us and really mostly the PLA. That's what I think is the big problem. Not so much how we're going to do it. I think the how they kind of have worked out. It's when, how fast, and what risks am I willing to take.
The costs of this are not insignificant. And I'm not talking the financial costs, which actually are pretty small compared to a major platform purchase. This is really small fry. But the organizational cost, every service across the US is almost busy beyond anything it's experienced the past 50 years. There is so much going on: change programs, transformation programs, new doctrine, new tactics, and then operations that are going on just about everywhere, whether they're live ops or whether they're deterrence ops, coercion ops, containment ops. Platforms are just out there. People are being maxed out. Where do you get the organizational time? How do you offset that cost in order to make this happen? Where's the training slack in all that? How do you make that happen? I guess because it's such a huge change, even if it happens incrementally, there is a cost to that which comes out of organizations, right? That's got to be seriously challenging.
Yeah, it is. I think it's over the past couple of years, the services have done some changes to their organizational structure in order to create dedicated experimentation capability. The Army conducted a massive reorganization, largest since the creation of TRADOC in 1973 and the creation of Army Futures Command. And that and those cross-functional teams, the U.S. Army clearly, focused then on this series of experimentations called Project Convergence, which went as far as they felt they could to include not just joint partners, but coalition partners. In this last instantiation, certainly I think all Five Eyes were participants, for example, in that set of experimentation. So that dedicated organization, that's one way to create the slack to do that. But inherently, those service-oriented efforts, and we could talk about the U.S. Navy as well. They also created special task forces, new units, and conducted a whole series of experiments. And even combatant commands are going out of their way to create opportunities for this kind of experimentation. Southern Command has created a whole innovation ecosystem to test unmanned platforms, unmanned capabilities, new surveillance capabilities inside their area of responsibility with their partners in order to promote industrial growth, industrial investment in solving some of their problems. So you have those kinds of pieces happening within small organizations. But more than that, DoD is trying to also create larger scale JTFs that can serve as experimental test beds. So there was some funding in the last NDAA to create an Indo-Pacific JTF that could focus not with assigned troops necessarily, but a headquarters that could focus on experimentation with these capabilities in real time using real data. So that's one way, is create these organizations, these lead agents to move these ideas forward, to accelerate experimentation, to create and generate credible evidence that allows for the decision makers to buy down risk, right? So that's a key part of that. The second part has been at the top, creating oversight. So how that's going to work with our partners is yet to be determined, because it's a much harder problem in Europe than it is in the US. But things like the Joint AI Center that now is part of the CDAO, the Chief Data and AI Office. But creating these superstructure entities that can control resources and can create initiatives, can offer incentives, because for us the services are still control their own budgets, but can offer incentives for cooperation and lay out guidelines for combining requirements. So those things are the way to go forward. And that's why I said, we're moving incrementally slow. These things don't happen overnight. So there's an authorization to create an Indo-PACOM JTF, but there is no Indo-PACOM JTF yet, right? That doesn't exist yet. There is the CDAO office, which has been in existence for less than a year, which that whole first year is just getting themselves organized and moving forward. So now what does that look like with our partners? What does that look like in Europe when we're talking about carving out Slack, dedicated organizations in a already resource constrained environment with authority to direct the allocation of resources or create incentives, one or the other? That's a much harder problem. Is it a EU initiative? Is it a NATO initiative? Is it something that's led by individual states and then hoping that the others then tag on, multi-state partnership that's outside of those two big umbrellas? But we're going to have to chase that problem first before you're really going to have any success in implementing new capabilities, I think, because you have to create evidence that's credible in order to convince decision makers and convince operators to support these ideas. And so the experimentation part's got to come first. And so maybe you have some insights as to how that's going to work over there.
I have no insights into how it works. I mean, I think the problem is that, as you said in your opening statement, I think so many people have been tarred and stained by EBO and NEC and lots of these programs that were designed to do big structural systemic changes either to C2 or other programs, that people worry about this being a dubious success, and where everyone's pulling on the people who have the skills needed to deliver this properly. And that's not just signalers and technologists. This is the contract writers, the commercial officers, the procurement executives. There's a whole group of people that need to support this, and just getting them the right people, the best people into this program is something that takes a good deal of persuasion, right? Because the scale of this is unimaginable. I mean, you talked about experimentation. We're seeing some really impressive experimentation with the stuff that's out there. We've seen stuff where we're connecting not just tens of devices, but hundreds of devices together. But actually, when we're talking about what this becomes in terms of level of ambition, the scale is, well, it's mammoth. I mean, it's not thousands of devices, it's tens of thousands of devices being connected together, right? Is this something that we think is really deliverable?
No, absolutely. I mean, we do that now. I mean, the internet works great. The Internet of Things works all the time. I have 130 different things in my living room that are connected. I monitor when my refrigerator door is open from wherever I am in the world traveling, right? I call my wife and say, hey, close the refrigerator. These things are absolutely doable at that scale, but we have to add some of those caveats that we talked about. So we have to add zero trust. We have to take into account national caveats. We have to be able to compute sufficient analytical capacity, decision-making options, AI on the edge. And so how do you deploy mini cloud capabilities to support those localized analytical engines, right? So there's still problems to solve, but we're well on their way across the board. I mean, I'm very optimistic about all of this.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because the internet is an amazing thing. It's sort of amalgam of patched networks that sort of come together and make everything function. We're incredibly reliant on it as a sort of species now, almost in the same way mobile connectivity has given us that ability to link and connect. And yet when you speak to people at Microsoft and other technology companies, they will tell you the internet is incredibly fragile. And no government can fix it. When the internet goes down, they can call people into this situation room of the White House and they can start talking about it. But it's up to Silicon Valley and their respective centers around the world to actually fix it. By the time the White House has finished talking about this stuff, it's either been fixed or there's a further outage or something's been. I mean, the patchwork is being done all the time. It's really, really dynamic. There's less political control. I guess the worry about that, the ubiquity of the idea of this spread across partners and coalitions and all the rest of that. You talked about it before. One of the critiques of a system like this will always be this presents a single attack surface to an adversary. This becomes their one target. They don't have to go after anything else now because they know if they can remove JADC2, that's it. The warfighting capability of the coalition has dropped through the floor. You talked about resilience being a core part of that right at the start. But that must be like a central concern to this all the way through. It becomes our key vulnerability that we've got to protect. I think that's the nervousness that many skeptics will have about this is all the eggs in one basket. Do you think that's warranted? I mean, I'm sure it was acknowledged as one of the chief concerns when you started to think and put this into practice. But do you think it's still being worked on, or is there the sort of excitement and the risk appetite that when the internet started, again, huge risk appetite, no one really lost out if it was going wrong. Learn by doing. Do you think they are competing philosophies that can't make this work, or do you think there's a clever way through that we've learned so much?
I think we can pull some anecdotes from what's happening in Ukraine as a way of assessing whether we think we're creating resiliency now, and then extrapolate from that going forward. And so you would have thought that before the war started, most analysts would have rated the efficiency of the Russian army as the top 2 or 3 most efficient armies in the world. And I'm not trying to argue with it, but objectively, they had the numbers, capabilities, allegedly the training to be able to, at a minimum, repeat some of the work that they did in Georgia with isolating communications and shutting down command and control capabilities, especially since this was 7, 8 years later. And you saw some very effective initial efforts by that. But then as you progressed forward in the last couple of years, what you've seen is that not only have they not been able to shut down command and control systems, but that it's actually grown and flourished. It's actually more capable now than it ever was in the Ukrainian sphere. And their ability to stay connected is more robust now than it ever has been. And so what has contributed to that? Well, certainly lots of unbelievably talented young men and women patching and extending networks physically, hardwiring, physically doing things, but also things like Starlink. And that is such an achievement that it bears a little more discussion, not because it doesn't matter that it's done by SpaceX, what company. It matters is this idea of a network of low Earth orbit, quickly replaceable satellites that offer this kind of level of resiliency to make it almost impossible to shut down comms completely. On top of that, if you don't want to launch them, you also have localized microsats that are being used that are deployable now with hot air balloons, for example, that can be deployed in unbelievable numbers within a 24-hour period to increase resiliency at the tactical level. So you're seeing more and more capabilities that make it nearly impossible. Even you say the fragility of the internet, I would counter that it's almost impossible to shut it down completely. In fact, I don't think it is. You can eliminate information availability in certain places for a small amount of time, but then you can reroute. So I think the resiliency is only going to increase, and the redundant layers are going to increase. The ability to move in and out of damaged areas and rebranch is going to continue to increase just because these technologies are already here. They're profitable, they're in demand, and there's no reason for industry not to keep working to extend that. In fact, we're even talking about, when I say we, I mean in general, industry is able to put some of these microsats on anything that moves, on anything that flies, right? So, the top of your tower at your base station, the helicopters, the cargo aircraft, just to extend the number of options available to maintain connectivity. So it's a pretty impressive piece. So I don't really think resiliency is going to be a limiting factor going forward.
And there must be something to it, right? Because, the Chinese, once again, the masters of espionage and copying the good stuff, as they've done with drones and aircraft, helicopters, ships. I mean, you name it. Imitation, greatest form of flattery, right? So the PLA has a system that is very similar in ambition, informationized warfare system that works along the same lines, that has the same level of ambition, that connect every platform, put it all together. We're almost getting to a stage where we have two systems that are competing, JADC2 versus informationized warfare. And it's not even just speed, it's coverage, it's redundancy, it's resilience. So much flows into that. We get into a different game, right? Where we have the systems, we were doing it for one reason. Now we almost can't walk back from it because the system has got to compete with the PLA system.
No, that's right. I mean, all of this is irrelevant unless it's better than theirs, right? We had the luxury during the unipolar moment of not really caring about our relative efficacy compared to potential adversaries, right? We were decades ahead in all forms that were measurable. It didn't matter. And then we blinked, and that isn't the case anymore. And what should have always been true is now, right in our face, and that is that our capabilities are only as good as they compare with our adversaries. So that is a critical facet, and their movement towards algorithmic warfare, their movement towards increasing the ability to intercept and block our communications, to destroy platforms based on the different multispectral signatures that they give out. the full spectrum of capabilities, from energetics to missiles to the smart sensor packages that go along with them, to size of the magazines, to resupply. All those things are being looked at as part of their informationized warfare concept, and therefore has to be part of our JADC2 or whatever we end up calling it, because, CJADC2, I'm sure the name's going to change as it gets reinvented. But in general, it is now a game of go. We're going to be maneuvering against them for at least another decade in order to try to figure out if we can deter in a way that's useful without spiraling into something that's crazy.
And how do systems like that interact? Do we have another example that we can fall back on that says when two systems like that interact of similar ambition, power, ubiquity, importance, when those two systems interact, then we get the following frictions, or they lead to mutual deterrence, or is there a coercion? Do we constantly seek within that for advantage in one area to acknowledge where the adversary is better and bypass them? Will this become a theoretical battle, which then we make decisions and pursue an avenue where we think is going to give us an advantage across the C2 spectrum? Or is there something where we just sit back and admire each other when these C2 systems come out in some form of sort of deterrence? We won't touch your JADC2 if you don't touch ours. The C2 systems come out of it. Or is this going to herald an era of counter C2 warfare that we haven't imagined for quite some time?
I think that's an area that's incredibly ripe for research. We at my work at Carnegie Mellon, we've recently started an initiative to look at just that problem, right? Is this generation of capabilities, Replicator as an example, is it going to spur a spiral that escalates tension? Or is it going to be effective in deterring international adventurism? And what are those conditions that we do that? Is a massive demonstration of some kind? Is that going to be a credible deterrent? That demonstration point that says, hey, we're at a level where you should take pause. This is reliable. This is capable. This is deployable right now. Or is it going to just, because the technology is changing so fast, just spur kind of an endless cycle of capability development? And at some point, you're causing the risk calculus to occur that deploying those capabilities now is better than allowing the cycles to continue forward, the escalation cycle. So, I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. I think it's a key question going forward is, how do we know if we're going to be effective in deterring, crazy or is crazy deterrable? I guess it's another problem, but as opposed to, creating a cycle of escalation.
I can almost see researchers around the world rubbing their hands with you saying, here's a great research question, needs more research, because that's the one thing everyone wants to hear, right? Ralph, listen, thanks for making time for coming on the show. We run over time, but it was just such a great conversation. I didn't want to stop. I think it's really important that the audience gets to grips with this before various nation states announce their wholesale adoption and importation of this concept without understanding what it's really all about. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
Systematic. Join your partners and allies already using our cutting-edge C4 ISR Citaware suite.
We hope you enjoyed the show, as well as telling your friends and colleagues about it. Please do subscribe, leave us a review on any of the usual podcast streaming platforms. This really helps us to reach new audiences and spread the word. The episode is produced by Aurelius Lab as a show for the Wavell Room, the home of intellectual curiosity and challenging thinking for military professionals everywhere. Thanks for listening.